Hello everyone and welcome back to Tokyo on Fire. Today is March 20th, 2015. Today's burning issue is Japan's emerging consumption tax. We've been talking about burning issues in this series, and the idea is to enlarge the discussion on these kinds of topics, globally and nationally. We tried a couple of different ways of doing this, first through a blog and then through a couple of breakfast briefings. Eventually, we settled on a podcast which included video and audio. So, for audio listeners, you can download on iTunes, and for the video, you can watch on YouTube. The particularly good aspect of YouTube is that you can add comments to the running dialogue that's going on. And the whole idea here is to engage you in the discussion. The topics that we choose are emerging, they're hot, they're really contemporary, and the ideas that we share here, although I'm joined with my collaborators, there are views, hopefully they're seeped in some sort of intelligence and background and some experience in the issues, but we're really doing this to engage you in this dialogue and to broaden it out. My name's Timothy Langley, and I'm joined with my colleague, Michael Chuchek. Michael Chuchek is Adjunct Fellow at the Temple University's Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. He's also the author of the foremost blog on contemporary Japanese politics entitled Shisaku. You can download that as well. Michael, welcome to today's discussion.
It's good to be back.
We're talking today about Japan's consumption tax. This has been going on now for about 10 years, the discussion of raising the consumption tax to prepare for the base of Japan's famously aging population, the social services that are needed, the declining population. It's just a huge thing. They initially started out with 5%, and incrementally they're going up. There is a target that is set somehow by the OECD or by economists that say for a country like Japan to have sustainable development, it needs to have a tax base probably at around 15%, 20%. It depends on who's making the comments and who's doing the analysis. What do you think about this?
The consumption tax is a great economics story, certainly. There are rules that one can cite in terms of economics. Unfortunately, here in Japan, and most likely anywhere, but most in Japan more than perhaps anywhere else in the world, the consumption tax is a political story. And it has been a political story since the 1980s. The imposition of the tax when it first started was extremely unpopular because while people understood that they needed to expand the tax base, there was a small tax base basically on white-collar workers and some blue-collar workers. But most people managed through various means to get out from paying income taxes. The consumption tax was to bring in all kinds of citizens into paying a single tax rate. That really upset a lot of people, and for the ruling LDP, the party that's in power, it has been their major, you might call it a millstone around their neck. Mm-hmm. All along through first the imposition of the tax and then the various rate hikes, it has always been very difficult to raise the tax, much more difficult than it is for some reason in other OECD countries where there's a VAT or there's a sales tax, as in the United States. There, the rates are much higher for the most part, and yet they're not hugely political, and they're not seen as detrimental to the economy. Here in Japan, however, it's quite different.
Well, it's kind of like disaster mitigation. You usually implement disaster mitigation when you're in a disaster, and it's a little bit too late for that. People need to have plans and programs in place before something like that happens. And similarly, with Japan, during the bubble era, nobody was thinking about consumption tax or building the base. In fact, nobody was really even talking about the declining population. They could see this years ago. The declining population and also the explosion of not geriatrics, but including geriatrics.
The number of retirees.
The number of retirees who are reducing the number of people who can contribute to the tax base through consumption and just being a contributor to the economic engine. but also the number of children who are being produced, who are going through college, who are entering the workforce as well.
The question always has been, what's the right mix between income taxes, both on individuals and corporations, and the consumption tax? The consumption tax is basically a baby of the ministries and the bureaucrats within the ministries. They have a long-term perspective and a very conservative one. They don't like to have surprises. And so they've been pushing very hard in the background through either direct appeals to the minister or to the vice ministers, or through various fora, the shingikai, the advisory councils that are put together in order to advise the ministries and advise the prime minister on what kind of policies to do, or even once they're out of the bureaucracy, reports, think tank briefings, all these things. They use this to sell this idea that Japan first needs a consumption tax, and then needs a very high one. Unfortunately, it's been not only a terrible sell in terms of getting people to do it, but something that's been rather difficult to understand. The Japanese economy is extremely fragile in ways that are hard to predict in some ways and hard to justify. For some reason, for example, in this last year, when the consumption tax was raised 3% from 5% to 8%, the resulting economic damage to Japan was staggering. And we ended up the year with negative economic growth, which nobody had foreseen. But for some reason, the loss of confidence that the raising of a tax engenders has ripple effects through the economy that everybody always gets wrong. And this has happened every time the tax has been raised. And the tax is going to be raised once again. In April of 2017, that's when Mr. Abe has said, I have delayed the tax rise that was supposed to happen this year in October. I'm going to delay it until April 2017. And that's final. I'm not going to change it again. Honest. Well, we'll see about that. But even if he keeps his promise, the pattern has always been a huge buildup of purchases just before the tax goes up, and then a staggering fall in consumption, in retail sales, and in GDP, way out of proportion to the actual damage that the tax should be actually doing upon confidence and upon the economy as a whole.
Well, nobody really wants to pay taxes, but people like the healthcare system that Japan is famous for. They like the support that is a basic structure of Japanese culture. But it is always unpopular. But it's not going to stop at 8 or 10%. It's going to continue on, and some estimates it's 15, 20, 25% eventually.
You're going to be a very unpopular person in Japan. Nobody in the government is talking seriously about anything beyond the 10% rise in 2017. At least no politician is. Maybe some of the bureaucrats are, and that's their business. They don't have to worry about being fired by the people, which all politicians do. And for every party, this was true not only for the LDP, but for the DPJ when it was in power. When the party that's in power votes for a rise in the consumption tax, it gets hammered in the next national election that happens. It happened to the LDP twice, and I believe it happened the first time also when the tax was first imposed at a 3% rate, way back when, long time ago. Each time when it went to 5, when it went to 8, when these votes happened, the party in power got hammered. And who wants to go through that?
Well, the administration is also suffering its own difficulties, even now, having pulled back. Imagine what it would have been like had the prime minister stuck to his guns and implemented the tax, damn the torpedoes. Well,
the economy seems to be on a recovery path, finally. There's some really good news that came out this week in terms of commercial land prices, which have been falling since the late 1980s, in a constant slide that has destroyed the value of many people. Well, much of the personal wealth of many individuals has eroded away through these land price falls. That seems to have stopped, which was if it's true, is very good news. There are interesting signs in terms of this week's negotiations of Shunto, spring offensive, labor agreements on wage rises.
Right. Toyota announced just this last week that they were going to increase it an enormous sum.
Yeah, it's an enormous sum. But the question is it enormous sum in terms of percentages? Mm-hmm. What the figure, when the newspaper's printed, looks big. But as compared to what they're already receiving, is it really a huge rise, or is it somewhere in the order of 1%? Is it even making up for the rise in the consumption tax? In most cases, no, because the consumption tax rose 3%. Mm-hmm. It's very unlikely that a person in April of this year will be making, in real terms, what they were making in April of last year. Mm-hmm. It's not very likely unless they're in some kind of high growth industry which is pushing wages up at a 4 or 5% rate.
Well, one of the really important things of this dialogue that we're having is that hopefully we integrate things that perhaps don't seem to be related but are related. And the economy here in Japan is so huge. It dominates all of Asia. It's one of the top 3 in the entire world. So things that happen here, even at a small level. So for example, the fact that Toyota, the largest manufacturer in Japan, raises wages. People have been waiting for this signal, for the wage rates to go up, because for all the power that Abenomics potentially has, if you don't raise the wages, it's not really going to take off.
Mr. Abe, when he first introduced Abenomics, and when he first introduced it, it wasn't called Abenomics. Eventually, pundits called it that. He had this circle of a virtuous circle.
Right.
He called it, where we would have vast expansions of the money supply, vast increases in fiscal spending, and public works, and that would engender inflation to a certain extent. But to make the whole circle go round, you needed to have the companies raise wages. Raising wages would mean that they could charge they have to charge higher prices on their goods. The higher prices on their goods allow them to hide, pretty much, taking a little bit more off the top, getting a little more profit. At that point, they pay more taxes, corporate taxes, into the system. Then the government's balance sheet is better, even despite the large expansions in the BOJ's balance sheet and also the increase in fiscal spending. It all works out.
It's actually huger than that. It is far more important. If you don't pay people a fair wage, a wage where they feel enthusiastic about their future, number one, they're not going to have children because they're concerned about what's going to happen to their future. And number two, they're not going to spend money. I mean, there is a lot of pent-up purchase frustration here, where people want to buy, but they're insecure about the future. And so the engine has not really kind of taken off.
There's a whole bunch of things that go into that. And it's certainly the case that having confidence in the future is vital.
Yes.
And to a certain extent, those who are in permanent employment have always had a certain degree of confidence. That's one of the things that people probably don't understand about Japan, is that when there are permanent workers and temporary workers, it's not as though there is some kind of you have some people that you can let go easily and others that you can't let go so easily. It's much more than that. The permanent workers, it's like an asset.
Yes.
It's like you can get a loan. You can get married because people will entrust their children to you. It's so vital for social stability. And yet, during the 1990s and the 2000s, labor market reforms made it easier to hire temps. And temps grew as a percentage. And now there are more than a third of all workers are on temporary contracts. And the thing is that once young people get into this temporary mode, they're stuck. Basically, in Japanese economic life, if you don't get a permanent position out of college, you're really, really in trouble. But we have a whole generation of individuals who have never been in permanent employment, have always been on temporary contracts. And even if you're in a temporary contract and you're paid well, and wages for temporary workers have gone up significantly, and you can see the anecdotal evidence here in Tokyo of, let's say, restaurant workers or people at supermarkets. The wages that are demanded, you can see it posted on the walls, they've soared in 2 years. But those people, even though they have more money, they're not in a social position and also in a personal position to spend more.
Yeah. Well, it's frequently said that when the United States gets a cold, Japan starts sneezing. And is that the right way?
Yeah, well, something happens to Japan that's not very good. Certainly the effects of the 2008 global economic crisis were felt worst in Japan than anywhere else in the world, even though Japan's banks were safe.
Yes. Well, the social compact that you're talking about, where the employers hire workers and dotes on them and treats them as part of their circle of family. I mean, traditionally that was how it was portrayed. Even though it's only a very small percentage, it's the concept of that. It's the aim that I think people aspire to as employees, and also the story that employees. It's the employers who want to convey that to their workers, so that you will join me, you will stay with me, I will take care of you. That social compact has really broken down. It's broken down a lot in the United States, where at will is predominant throughout most of the states. And here it's not at will. I mean, it's either a contractor or a permanent employee.
Yeah.
There are signs that that's breaking down as well. I mean, people are being let off somewhat willy-nilly in industries that are suffering.
One of the issues is that there's an international standards that are being applied to Japan that may not be functionally effective.
Right.
You hear a lot, and you've heard a lot from the Abe administration regarding labor reform. And one of the big bills of this current diet session is the creation of a special category of individuals who are on contracts but cannot be given or cannot be paid overtime, but they can be made to do overtime. And it's a special class, and it's above a certain income level, which is quite high, well above the national median. But this erosion of the concept of the permanent worker is very frightening to a lot of people. And the opposition parties just pile up on the government whenever any kind of change to the way permanent workers are treated is ever voiced. But international investors and the international community press very hard on Japan, saying your labor systems are archaic, they're frozen, you can't fire anybody, no one's going to do direct investment in your country. Change it so that the government, no matter what it is, whether it's LDP or DPJ or whatever, always is vacillating and stuck between these two international and domestic forces.
Well, this is our 7th series in Tokyo on Fire. Earlier in one of the series, we were talking about TPP. And certainly with the inclusion of TPP, assuming that Japan joins the TPP negotiations and signs off with the other countries, there's going to be more and more of this. And it's true that hiring people in Japan, especially for foreign companies, setting up a business here, it is fraught with difficulties because it's somewhat of an outlier with regard to companies dealing globally. Some of the rules and regulations here are rather old-fashioned. They match the Japanese culture, and not many people are that very familiar with it.
No, but I remember once listening to an Indian economist say, well, the rules are there. Too bad. Those are the rules. If you want to play in the Japanese market, you have to play by the Japanese rules.
Right.
What's the problem? But for many international investors, it is a problem. And for many international businesses, it is a problem because it puts their personnel decisions and personnel departments in a strange bind where they have to have a special category of hiring and firing and promotion, all these things just for Japan.
Well, structural reform is the third arrow.
Right.
And unless there is structural reform, you're not going to have this infusion of foreign capital setting up new operations. People who are not working in permanent capacities inside Japanese companies, they are freelancers or they've set up their own companies, developing like in what happened in Silicon Valley, taking their own ideas, investing their own money, building new and marvelous applications, games, products. That is also being retarded as well.
It's true. But I think you have to talk about two different things. Well, the first is the international business, I guess you call it environment, where you have a certain set of standard rules all around the globe. Japan has always resisted that, and as just part of its way of interacting with the globe. And yes, there are certain cultural aspects, there are certain economic aspects to that resistance. But you're right, it has had a restrictive effect. But what a lot of people say is, look, we have a shrinking youth population. We have, the people, they just recently did the census, and in terms of, let's say, 18 and 19-year-olds, we have a cohort of 2.4 million coming in who will become seijin in the next 2 years, the smallest cohort ever. They're saying, look, we have fewer and fewer young people, and there's plenty of jobs for them. We have right now, the highest level of jobs per job seeker that we've had in 25 years. There are so many positions available, maybe not at the salaries people want, but they're there. They're saying, look, we have fewer and fewer possible workers and more jobs available. What do we need international business people to come in for? There's nothing there. All that's going to happen is that the freedoms and the protections that we have already enjoyed and want to keep will be eroded.
Well, I mean, there is something to say for protecting the Japanness of Japan, the cultural aspects.
But the Japanness of Japan is the second point I want to bring up, which is permanent employment has been a killer for innovation. It's great for companies that have the ability to bank some of their inventions and take their researchers and hold on to them for years and years and years, hold on to inventions, hold on to patents. Japanese corporations used to be the world leader in patents year in, year out, because the major corporations were just churning them out. Nevertheless, try to name a major, I guess, let's say a computer firm or
a service provider
or a computer services provider that was founded in the last 20 years. No, Japan doesn't produce these companies. You can name dozens, hundreds of companies, not only in the U.S. And Silicon Valley, where it's all famous, but all over the globe, and especially in Europe as well. So it's a devastating effect. People don't want to leave their permanent positions because it's a social value.
It is a security.
It's a security. And they work very hard in terms of getting recruited into the company when they're just out of college, or maybe sometimes just out of high school. They don't want to ever break out. There's no such thing as 40-year-old entrepreneurs breaking out. It just doesn't happen. But what has happened, of course, is that Japan's innovation rate has gone down. And it's certainly, in terms of creating new companies, it's almost zero. We just had, for example, the election of a new set of vice presidents for the Keidanren, Japan's major, the top business lobby. Not one of the 13 new individuals, I think it's 13, the new managers that were elected as vice presidents to the board, not one of them was from a company that was under 100 years of age. The youngest company was 102. If you don't have in your business lobby people who have a lifetime of innovation behind them and taking on the rules and breaking the rules or bending them, whatever, your economy is going to be sclerotic.
Well, it has been. I mean, for the last 20 years, Japan is still trying to dig itself out of a long-time depression. Economists from all over the world are trying to study how has this happened and how can they get out of it. They've tried different things. They've studied different examples internationally and come up with some good ideas. I think maybe with luck, Abe will be successful in bringing the company out of this and interjecting a little bit more energy.
He's tried. And that's the whole thing behind Abenomics. Abenomics is the test case for
Italy,
all over the world. That's right. Any place where there has been an unusual and an unnecessary contraction of the economy and where contractionary policies, cutting budgets, cutting spending, reducing the number of public servants, that kind of action has taken hold as an ideology. Japan with Abenomics is trying to do the exact opposite and show that it works. Mm-hmm. It's possible, however, that Japan's the worst place in the world to do it. And that's due to the various structural problems that the third arrow, which is still not coming out, is supposed to deal with. Mm-hmm. Which brings us back to the consumption tax.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about why this is a burning issue for us today.
It's a burning issue because the party that is most likely, well, the party that holds the sort of the leverage on the government is the Komeito. The Komeito
party of the people.
Well, they think of themselves as the party of the people. Their first self-image was the party of peace. Mm-hmm. It's a party based that was originally founded by the Soka Gakkai lay Buddhist order, and this was in the 1960s. The party and the religious order split in the 1970s, but basically everyone who votes Komeito, by and large, is a member of the Soka Gakkai. Now, inside the Soka Gakkai, it's a very interesting religion. The powerful, powerful voices are of women, and particularly older married women. And surprise, surprise, the people who go to the supermarket and go shopping don't like the consumption tax. Mm. So it's a burning issue now is we have to go through this consumption tax raise, according to Mr. Abe in 2017. Luckily, 2017 is past the 2016 House of Councilors elections. So whatever happens, it'll be after the elections, so it won't hurt the LDP and its coalition partner, the Komeito. But the Komeito's playing hardball because the married ladies division says it doesn't want to pay more.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's like in any Japanese meeting that you might ever want to attend.
Nobody wants to do that.
Well,
I mean, face it.
Sure.
But nobody wants to. They do attend.
But the thing about it is that anything that you're going to discuss in that kind of a meeting has been discussed to death earlier. Decisions have already been made, and then you hold the meeting, right? So similarly, all of the things that are being decided now, all of the things that are being discussed on the consumption tax, on splitting the consumption tax, do we include food and drink? Do we include newspaper? Do we include rice? Do we include lots of different things? And in other countries who have gone through the same sort of pain have divided it up, and some things will be taxable and some things will not be taxable. All of those discussions are going on right now.
The thing is, there are two streams out of that. The first is that a lot of those countries where they do have special rates for special products, they found, surprise, surprise, it distorts spending, it distorts investment, it distorts the way people behave. Mm-hmm. And many of the governments are now thinking, that was kind of stupid to do that. Mm-hmm. We should have had just a simple single tax rate and then people make economic decisions based on a completely neutral flat playing field.
Sure, that's easy for the administrators. But the fact is that the real pain of paying a consumption tax is on the lower income people.
That's true. And again, that's where the Komeito comes in. The Komeito started out, though it's a little bit more prosperous now, it started out as a religious order that attracted the young urban migrants who were very poor coming in from the countryside in the 1960s and 70s. They were pulled into the religion. So they have a very, very conservative, very, very cramped view, and many times they're not very wealthy. And the consumption tax really hits them. And it really hits them psychologically and often right in their pocketbooks because they're not among the wealthiest people.
Well, you and I have been here for a long time. We have friends, we have family who are members of Komeito. We know how they live. We know that they tithe. People contribute to the organization, the religion.
Yeah.
Yes. And so it's a major component. I mean, you can't say that you understand Japanese culture and the texture of Japanese society without understanding the role that Komeito plays politically and economically. It's huge.
But we have up until now. Finally, a new book has been released. It was released in the fall of last year by a group of scholars led by Stephen Reed of Chuo Daigaku, Chuo University, which has finally looked at the Komeito not as this strange boogeyman, which is the way that all of the weekly magazines look at it, as a cult, as a dangerous pseudo-fascist group who do nefarious things. It's looked at the party in an honest, open way. And that book has only just become available in the English language. And it probably will be translated into Japanese because it is so fair to this party, which has otherwise been ignored. And it's strange that it's been ignored because it's been the coalition partner of the LDP since the 1990s. It is 8 million votes, 7 or 8 million votes every election, and they're going to show up and they vote. And they vote 90% or more rates. North Korean levels. We're talking real voting strength there. And the LDP in its last few elections, 1/4 of the votes, by and large, that it received in the district elections can be in some way attributable to Komeito voters.
Okay.
So the LDP is bound to these people, cannot get rid of them, and cannot possibly say, oh, we have friends elsewhere. And that's particularly true because of the collapse of the far-right parties in the last election. But now they're bound to the Komeito, and the Komeito is the tail that wags the dog here.
But there's still a distinct delineation between Jiminto and Komeito, right? And Jiminto is in power. It is the guerrilla that occupies the main seat. It does need Komeito for swing votes, and it has shared some of the power with Komeito. The biggest issue facing the Abe administration, I think Mr. Abe has taken a personal challenge to it, is the defense spending and the projection of Japanese military might, at least regionally. And I think that there's probably a little bit of horse trading that needs to go on. If he's going to get his way on that big issue, he's got to give up a little bit on the tax issue. They've committed to the tax. It is going to go from 8 to 10%. But to take care of the consumer issues, for example, foodstuffs, that sort of thing, breaking it up. I mean, the administration prowess of Japan it's famous. I mean, the bureaucracy here really manages everything. And the fact that they didn't hit their numbers in the last reiteration is shocking to me because of anything that a government does, it probably does tax collection and tax analysis the best because it's relatively non-adversarial. It's just you have to pay this tax. Everybody's agreed to it. It's on the law. If you don't, we will take over your land. We'll take over your property. We'll raid your bank accounts.
Yeah. Well, the consumption tax, they really can't do anything much against you. If you don't buy anything, you don't pay the tax.
Right. They can't have that either.
That's the problem. When people don't buy anything, there goes the economy. But the trade-off regarding defense spending is one that probably people don't think about. I certainly have not thought about it enough. But certainly, indeed, if Abe wants to work on his security,
he's got to give something up.
He has to. His security program costs money, and yes, you can budget it, but if you're going to put things in the budget, they have to be paid for. And if it's paid for out of people's what they pay at the supermarket checkout stand in terms of taxes directly, immediately in front of them, and it's a really right in their face kind of action, there's going to have to be a trade-off, particularly with the ladies of the Soka Gakkai. Now, in terms of anything beyond that, in terms of actually starting to pay for the social costs and paying for the healthcare costs of this vast group of baby boomers that are coming through the system. They're now finally leaving the labor force. Well, you say finally, it's really problematic that they're leaving the labor force. A lot of them are staying on their companies on temporary contracts. A lot of them are taking part-time jobs. But all these people have to be paid for. And the number of workers is simply not going to be large enough in terms of income taxes. So the consumption tax has to go up, is the way people portray the story.
Well, people also aren't getting married. And before you have children, typically you get married first. And so there is this cycle that's going on. And there's an interesting statistic that it's somewhat humorous, but I think it's really telling. That did you know that there are more dogs in Japan than there are children? And when I'm saying dogs, I'm talking about the dogs that people walk around and they dress up in nice outfits and they put them in, not baby carriages, dog carriages, and you see them all over. It's a huge industry.
Yeah, and I actually did know that. And it's not surprising if you consider the number of households in the country and also Japanese attitudes towards pets. But certainly, what are large growth industries, toys, diapers, etc., in other countries are here contracting stories. Diapers are a special case because we have special adult-sized diapers for an increasingly large incontinent senior citizen cohort. And you're seeing the ads a lot now on television, which you didn't see a few years ago. You can see the social transformation that's taking place, for example, through advertising. The government's role in all of this, of course, should be, let's be responsible. Let's be prepared to pay for these things. But it's been almost impossible to talk seriously about the future. And it's been very difficult under this current administration, which took what was a strength of Japan, which was its fiscal and, well, not fiscal conservatism. If you look at the amount of the budgets that is paid with tax receipts and the amount that is done through bond issuance, you lose your cookies on looking at the numbers there. But in terms of the management of the currency, the management of the various assets of the Bank of Japan was very conservative. That conservatism is out the window. And what anything is valued right now is very, very much in the air. Now, there are people who predict catastrophe. There are people who can predict muddling through. But the government has completely just simply given up on trying to play the parent in all of this, to be the mature adult voice. There's nobody who does that. And the people who tried, like Noda Yoshihiko, the last of the DPJ prime ministers, who tried to portray himself as a level-headed thinking person, his party was destroyed in the 2012 election, just completely wiped out. So there's no political incentive there.
One of the great things about living in Japan, and I know you've experienced it as well, is that you can live here for even a brief period of time, a year, 2 or 3 years, and before your very eyes, you see things happen at a structural level that really dynamically change how business is done, how traffic flows, how the city, the center of the city actually begins to shift throughout town. These changes, sometimes they're so slow that when we live here, we only notice them in retrospect after having seen it for a while, and then all of a sudden it kind of grabs us. What do you think in the next, let's say 6 months, in the very short term, is going to happen with regard to the consumption tax issue and the impact of the consumption tax that's going to hit the radars, and you and I are going to acknowledge that, gosh, we didn't see this coming in. Hasn't that been rather interesting?
But what you're asking me is, what is it that we don't see that I can see? If we can't see it right now, I'm not going to be able to comment on that, obviously, but I can see somewhere in the future, within the near future, with even 6 months, that there could be a crisis in Abenomics. And when I mean a crisis in Abenomics, I don't mean an economic collapse. I mean simply that the
follow through.
Right. Well, it's the matching up between the rhetoric, the predictions, and what actually happens in the economy. We have a lot of things being thrown in, including the kitchen sink. We have fiscal easing, we have monetary easing, we now have also the GPIF, the pensions fund, is changing the way that it allocates its investments so that it's buying more stocks.
Maybe perhaps even agriculture.
No, whatever it is. In this case, but in some way, what we're seeing here is the Abe administration is gaming the system. They're gaming the system, loose money, loose spending, and then having the GPIF and other pension funds and other big funds jumping into the stock market and pushing up prices very high so that it's the appearance of prosperity, but all that it is simply injecting money in there, what was called a price-keeping operation, PKO, in the 1990s. That these PKOs are happening, making it look as though the economy is getting better, when underneath there's really no engine for growth. There's just a simple reallocation of going on, that there aren't good companies that are being invested in. That can appear in a 6-month time frame. And at that point, lo and behold, we're right on the edge of the LDP presidential election, which happens in September of this year.
Bad timing.
Bad timing. Very bad timing. And so you probably will see a lot of ways, if they can figure out how to get past the impasse of April, for the government to try to really push to get good economic numbers so that there isn't a challenge against Abe. Right now, there's nobody really on the horizon in terms of taking on Abe in the presidential election for the LDP in September. But that could change. And that's where I think is the problem, because so far, the Bank of Japan has completely lost its credibility in terms of its inflation targets. Inflation's basically at 0%. It was supposed to be at 2% at this time. They promised that they would do it. Of course, there are extenuating factors like the worldwide collapse in the price of oil. But nevertheless, if you say you're going to do something, you had better do it.
Right.
And they haven't been able to do it. Despite the fact that we've had all this noise about the third arrow. The third arrow reforms have not excited the international investors in international markets, and they've not excited domestic investors in domestic markets. So at some point, you'd think the rhetoric, they have to pay for the rhetoric that they've used.
Right. Well, if you watch the yen-dollar exchange rate too, the yen keeps getting less and less valuable. It makes things far more expensive to produce and to purchase from overseas, the inputs to production, to purchase those and to get the engine going here. For the export market, it is good. But the fact is that the people who have money in this country always have money. And those who don't, it's just beginning to become bigger and bigger, and including more and more consumers, people who are not on the permanent employee lists, the fritas, the people who are working,
and retirees. So the people who consume less by nature, and who don't, in the case of the freeders or the people in temporary work, don't have sufficient savings, don't have a cushion. The population, the percentage of the total population that they represent is, you're right, it's growing. At which point you say, well, maybe it's not going to work. Maybe the Abenomics experiment is not going to work. And then the loss of confidence in that is a huge crisis that may take place.
Nobody's talking about that.
Well, no one would.
It's unpleasant.
No one would talk about that, because if you were in the finance industry, your colleagues would hang you. You don't want to talk about bad times. You only talk about good times and good opportunities. It's normal. You're never going to find in any of the finance news networks predictions of economic collapse, because that's not what their readership wants to read.
Well, is it kind of like muddling along? Because I get a sense that there are so many decision points to be made between now and when the consumption tax is supposed to kick in April of 2017. There are a lot of decision points that can be made. We will know the answer to that at the end of this year. But there's a lot that can happen in the meantime, too. there is no real, on the horizon, aspect or event that is being predicted that will come up and inject the economy or inject the population. We've got the Olympics.
But they're talking about, for example, they are talking about the Japan Post IPO. Mm-hmm. When that entity goes public and provide, it will be almost certainly the largest IPO ever in history, larger than the Alibaba one in China.
Hugest bank in the world.
It's the world's biggest bank, has 1.7 trillion dollars, 1.7 trillion dollars in assets. It's simply the largest financial institution in the world, no question. And everybody will have to have it in their portfolio. So it'll be part of everyone's allocations, and it will be huge. Mm-hmm. And people talk about that as the vanguard. But the thing is, the proceeds from that sale are already budgeted. Mm-hmm. They're already budgeted for reconstructing the Tohoku. If you look at the way that they've divvied up the way that Mr. Abe's most recent promises regarding reconstruction of the Tohoku after the triple disaster are put in, the chunk that comes from the post office is huge. That's assuming that they can sell the post office shares at a great price, but it's already spent. Mm-hmm. It's already accounted for. It's not as though it's going to be that those proceeds are going to be taken and going to be reducing Japan's debt, for example.
Right.
That's not going to happen. But the story is what's important, the narrative, mm-hmm. and a narrative of IPOs that all these either corporations that are owned by the government or divisions of companies mm-hmm. that are worth hiving off and making them private enterprises that are then brought out as IPOs. That's a narrative that interests the world's bankers, and certainly one that they're going to try promoting, I'm sure.
Well, undoubtedly, the most difficult of the three arrows is the one that hasn't been really approached yet. That is structural reform. Japan is famous for being a managed economy. The power is centralized in Tokyo, and it is centralized in Tokyo within the various ministries who have domain over special aspects of the Japanese economy, in particular the Ministry of Trade and Industry that is managing the regulations and the rules, but also the Finance Ministry, the Ministry of Justice, and that sort of thing. Releasing the requirements is always going to involve somebody else not getting what they were typically getting, what they were comfortable with getting, and actually redistributing that. That could engender a whole birth of new industries and new energy into the economy, but people are going to be damaged from that as well.
That's always the case with structural reform.
Right.
The story of structural reform is that it is deflationary and depressive in the short term, but it's for future growth. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the Abenomics story so far has been sugar first, then the bitterness. Mm-hmm. You're supposed to have the bitterness first and then the sugar. The sugar was monetary easing and fiscal spending, and now all we have left is the bitterness. Mm-hmm. If they do real structural reform, the economy will contract, and there will be deflation. And we don't even have inflation after the Bank of Japan opening all the spigots. We're back at zero again.
Kind of out of breath, and you have to swim another 20 yards underwater.
It's the timing, the sequencing has been terrible. Mm-hmm. Okay. So people talk about the third arrow and talk about the failure of the third arrow. Well, it's almost water under the bridge now. Mm-hmm. You really can't go anywhere. If you do real structural reform, people are going to get hurt, and it'll hurt confidence. Mm.
Okay, well, with that dour assessment, I'd like to draw today's discussion to a close. You've been watching Tokyo on Fire. Today's burning issue has been Japan's consumption tax. If you'd like to provide a comment to us, you can do that in one of two ways. You can either access us on Twitter using hashtag TokyoOnFire, or via email, just post your comment to comments@tokyoonfire.com. This podcast is available on iTunes and on YouTube. Thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for next week. Thank you very much.